This is Our Anxiety Stories, the Anxiety Canada podcast with John Bateman. This is the place where people from all walks of life share their anxiety stories to remind you that you are not alone. If you have an anxiety story you'd like to share, contact us at anxietycanada.com/ouranxietystories.
My name is John Bateman. You're listening to Our Anxiety Stories, the Anxiety Canada podcast, which can be found at anxietycanada.com and most of your popular podcast platforms. Today, my guest is Ayla Tesler-Mabé. She's a musician, producer, songwriter, apparently guitar aficionado, from what I've seen. Ayla, welcome.
Thank you so much.
Wonderful to have you here.
Wonderful to be here.
Great. So you know a bit of the drill. You know what I do, and the podcast is Our Anxiety Story. So Ayla, what's your anxiety story?
Where do I even begin? I feel like in many ways it's been intertwined with most parts of my life, which I think is true for many, many people. Mm. But yeah, I suppose the first thing I think of is growing up in a family with people who have just experienced too much. And as a result, I think there's a pretty significant, like, intergenerational kind of trauma, anxiety sort of thing that's always existed.
Could you elaborate a bit on when you say experience too much? Is it too much is it too much anxiety? Is it too much trauma? We don't have to go too deep into the details on that, but when you say too much, what does that mean?
Yeah, just like the kind of like the most extreme things humans can go through.
Right.
A lot of war and you know, genocide and like really heavy stuff where like understandably that would really shape your perception of the world and you know the kind of messages you would impart to your children. But rightfully so, I get it. But yeah, it definitely created an environment where I never fully realized until this year when I moved out for the first time and I was able to have a bit of distance and sort of reflect a little more on that yeah, you know, there's a lot of fear, anxiety, a lot of, you know, still enjoying life, but always having that thought at the back of your mind that, you know, whatever stability you have in the moment could change very suddenly, because it's happened to, I mean, pretty much everyone in my family other than my generation.
Is that right?
I'm the first generation of people in my family to have stability.
So, without getting into specifics, you're a generation of your family moved here to Canada?
Yeah, no, I mean, I'm happy to talk about that.
I would love to hear some about that.
Yeah, I mean, it's an interesting story where for the past couple of generations, most of my family was in South America, Argentina and Chile, though my family's Jewish. So obviously that comes with, you know, a lot. And yeah, you know, my mom being raised by a Holocaust survivor and my dad having to live through war in Argentina when the military coup came to power in 1976. And
wow.
Yeah, he's seen things that I can't even imagine. Yeah. And it's only slowly over time that I've sort of started piecing together what that was
that
like.
Stuff that was openly shared with you, or was it just basically implied in your household?
Quite open. I know there are a lot of people whose families don't talk about those sorts of things, but I guess it just is the nature of my family where generally those things are pretty open, but at the same time, it's because it can be such a heavy thing. Like with my dad, I don't just out of the blue ask him a question about what that was like. It's usually a very particular moment where I don't know, I want to ask more, or he chooses to share something.
Right.
But yeah, I'd say it's a pretty open family. It probably helps that my dad is a psychiatrist. And my mom is a psychologist.
Very interesting.
So
okay.
Obviously, in general, I'd say conversations about this sort of stuff and mental health and everything, there definitely wasn't the kind of stigma that I know a lot of people grow up with, at the very least. So you, when you were growing up, your parents were practicing both these disciplines, I guess, sort of when you were born or around that time. Yeah.
What kind of indicators did you have, like with your own experience with anxiety? You know, did you? Yeah. I don't want to ask too much because I want to get the real deal. But you know, did you start feeling something? Was it behavioral? What kind of stuff that sort of made you realize that you were having anxiety yourself?
It's funny. I feel like it wasn't until extremely recently, like
Really?
maybe the past year or two, that I kind of was able to say, oh, maybe there is something here I could label as anxiety. Maybe I could consider medication and, things like that. I think, because my experience seemed very different from what I had seen in other people around me. For some reason, I just assumed it wasn't something I dealt with. But I mean, from the time I was like 8, for example, anytime I got a needle, I would faint, and I know that's not a totally uncommon thing.
No, but it's still, there's a trigger that's happening there, and there's a physical reaction. Yeah, probably fear happening there or something like that.
Yeah, like a, what do they call it? Vasovagal.
Yeah.
Syncope type of situation.
Right.
But yeah, I think when I really started realizing it was more than just, I'm scared of needles and I faint, was when I a couple times fainted when there were no needles present.
Okay.
And I was like, what's going on? And then I didn't realize until, again, just like in the past 2 years, speaking with my therapist, that's an anxiety attack. Oh, right. I didn't know that. I just thought I was dying. I don't know.
So that's interesting, because growing up with parents that had experienced trauma, serious trauma, and who have been trained professionally, but obviously you didn't exhibit this in front of them.
Yeah, I suppose not. I mean, the fainting, for sure. I mean, they obviously knew about that. Yeah, they were with me when I would completely pass out. And
they would have had a way to rationalize around why that was happening, but they wouldn't have necessarily said, oh, Ayla's got an anxiety issue.
Yeah, it was just really interesting, I think. Yeah, I would actually now want to ask them exactly what they thought and how their perception of whether or not I have anxiety or how I deal with it has changed over time. Because now, I mean, my dad is so helpful, and he's helped explain different medications to me, and he's the guy who's kind of helping manage, like, if you're going to switch, you should, first go down to a lower dose of the new one and then build up, as opposed to, just immediately switching to
it's funny. I always thought I'd want a father who could teach me auto mechanics or something, but that's a pretty good one. I mean, I've had a lot of anxiety, depression issues myself, and having, that's great to have that at your disposal. But, I guess another thing that I'd be curious to know, and maybe you don't know, but were your parents covertly, helping you out with anxiety, but maybe not the same kind of language? Like, did they see anything happening, or the environment that they created, were they able to kind of help you control it with the way they had life set up for you at home?
Interesting question.
I guess you'd have to reflect back.
Yeah, I really have to think. But I think in a way, yes, because I know they have dealt with a lot of things that they choose not to share with me just because they don't want to burden me with that. So in a way, yeah. And maybe because I'm, the younger child, I have an older brother. Okay. There's that inherent kind of sheltering that usually happens. So I'm sure that's part of it. Though at the same time, I don't know. I think there have been things, and no parent is perfect. And they're the first people, they always say that to me.
Yeah,
when I say that I have so much gratitude for them and everything, immediately they say, oh, but we haven't been perfect. And like, they are always...
I'm still waiting for my kids to say that to me, that they have so much gratitude. We're still waiting for that. But I'm glad you say that to them. That's very kind. Yeah. Coming from a parent's perspective. Because for me, I having a lot of mental health experience, I kind of covertly would talk to my children about mental health stuff without them really knowing I'm talking about mental health stuff. It still doesn't stop things from happening. So when you first started, thinking, this is something, what kind of things were you experiencing? Were you experiencing, you said, you mentioned a panic attack. Do you remember having what you thought was maybe your first panic attack, or what was that first experience, kind of what that felt like physically for you? Yeah.
So I think the first major one I can remember, because I think there have been some examples of that when I was quite a bit younger, but the biggest kind of perspective changing one was when I was on a plane, like how many years ago? 3 years ago? First time traveling without my parents. I was just in a very stressful situation at that time with people where the dynamics were really complicated.
At this point, were you into what you're into now? Like, your musical career was moving along?
Absolutely. This was for music. That's why I was on the plane.
Yeah.
And, I remember a bunch of factors kind of converged where, I'm very sensitive in my body and my spirit, but in my body, like I get headaches very often. Like if I don't get enough water, if I don't get enough food, if I don't get enough sleep, if I'm a little upset, if I'm a little whatever.
Yeah.
And, I was just dealing with some kind of complicated interpersonal dynamics at that time. First time traveling without my parents, way too much sun that day. And I kept asking everyone around me, hey, could we maybe like chill and get some food? And they're like, no, we got to keep walking. We got to keep going. We can't get water. We have to keep going before it. And I'm like, come on. And so not enough water, not enough food, not enough sleep, too much sun.
It's all just building towards this.
Yeah. But then this is the kicker. I was watching Kill Bill and there's a pretty...
You're adding a lot of really visceral triggers to this anxiety attack.
Absolutely. Yeah. And
this is all starting to make sense to me. Yeah.
There's a pretty disturbing revelation quite early on into the film when one of the main characters wakes up from a coma and she realizes what had been happening to her while she was comatized.
Comatose?
Comatose. Thank you.
There it is.
Comatized.
I like comatized.
Maybe that'll become... Never mind.
We'll hashtag it.
Yeah?
Yeah, sure.
There'll be one post under that hashtag. But yeah, I all of a sudden felt like I had this terrible stomach ache. All of a sudden, I couldn't even tell exactly what was happening. I just kind of felt like I was dying. I don't know how to describe it other than
that's often described that way.
Yeah, every part of my body felt like it was
they're
shutting
having a heart
down.
attack, they're dying, they're going to faint, they're going to die.
100%.
It's so common.
Yeah, and then before I knew it, I passed out. And
wow. So you're on the plane at this point.
Yep. And
like 35,000 feet.
Yeah. Yeah.
Wow. On your own. Mm-hmm. Okay.
Yeah. And well, I was with some other people that I was working with at the time.
But you're not with your trusted core.
Yes.
Gotcha.
Exactly.
Yep.
And yeah, when I woke up, I was unconscious for like quite a while.
And so people just assumed you were sleeping at this point or something?
No, because I was holding a bottle of water and I dropped it.
Wow, okay.
And so the people I was with were like, oh, Ayla, you dropped your water. And then they're like, oh, she's unconscious. So by the time I woke up, there were like a good 100 people staring at me.
Really?
Because they had been like paging doctors. Is there a doctor on the flight? I woke up, there were all these people next to me. All the flight attendants were there. All the people were looking.
Which on itself, coming out of an experience like that or even experiencing a panic attack with a lot of people focusing on you, very disconcerting and discombobulating, right?
Yeah, and I don't know if you've ever fainted, but the feeling of regaining consciousness is very...
I haven't, and I don't know. Well, describe it to me.
How could I describe it? I've experienced this more significantly when I've fainted for longer periods of time, but there's a moment where you're regaining consciousness where you genuinely don't know anything. You don't know anything. I can't describe it. It's like
your name, who you are.
I don't know my name. I don't know where I am. I think
people
what
have woken up.
Anything
people
is.
wake up from dreams on occasion. That's happened to me.
Yeah.
I don't know where I am. I don't even remember my name. It's very disorienting.
Yeah, and it's very stressful to feel that. I can't even describe that feeling, really.
When you came out of this and you had your panic attack, your proper panic attack, what were your feelings after that? Like, did you have anxiety right away after that? Like, I would see myself just going into like cyclical fainting, like waking up disoriented, anxiety, faint, waking up. What was your experience? What did that feel like, or how did that feel?
I've fainted so many times before in my life that I was kind of like, this is another fainting spell, though obviously a new type. So I did have the thought that there was something to look into, and as I assumed, as soon as we landed, my parents were there at the airport and they heard what had happened. They're like, we should go to the hospital and just get you checked out, take some tests, whatever. Yep. And that being said, I think I was okay. And this is a fascinating part of my personality I'll reveal. There was a secret part of me that loved the fact, like, it was very disconcerting as I was regaining consciousness, and then finally I realized where I am, but I can't move.
Yep.
Like, that's also a very stressful thing to feel. But then as I was like, okay, almost back, you know, I was like, oh, everyone's watching me. I can make some jokes, and I have everyone in the palm of my hand.
Yeah.
That's
great.
one thing I've noticed when I faint.
The performative part of you comes out.
Which is such a strange thing.
Because, I mean, that's something else I will ask you, but not right now. But
that's how I make light of those situations, I guess.
So, you know, did you find after that situation, have you ever at a point where like anxiety has been sort of more prevalent throughout your day, like day to day kind of, there's been a level of it that you would consider to be sort of above what you consider to be comfortable?
Oh, absolutely. I think I had been facing it for a while, but I never fully realized until maybe COVID. There were just some really complicated dynamics at home. I probably won't get too much into that, but I know that was definitely making things on a day-to-day basis very, very stressful. And then I moved out, and, you know, this year, 2022, has probably been one of the most transformative years of my life by far.
As it would be by virtue of your age, period. But let alone what you're coming up. Because I have a daughter who's 20, and her whole life, where you're supposed to be graduating, moving on, going to college, it just really got wrecked. Yeah. And so you know, a lot from this generation, from that year, got, you know, kind of held back when they really didn't want to be. Yeah. That was certainly a big factor there. And then this year, I feel like I've gone through some hugely monumental changes. But it was really interesting. Finally, this past spring, I was thinking about it, and I was like, maybe I'm going to try medication and see what happens. Yeah. And I can't even explain the difference in how I feel. So what was the feeling before medication? Like was your anxiety controlling you? Like, was it holding you back? Well,
what's really interesting about it is I feel like it came out the most in extreme perfectionism and an extreme fear of failure, which in a way obviously impacts your work negatively, though at the same time it can be a driving force and was a very significant driving force in me doing what I do and being as ambitious as I am and as hardworking as I can. But it's not a pleasant experience to work hard because you have a crippling fear of failure. That's not a pleasant motivator.
No.
It's not.
No, of course not. So you have that, but then you went on medication that obviously, can you explain to me a little bit how, you know, what subtle changes might have happened that and how that served you?
Oh, I'd say not subtle at all.
Really? Okay, interesting. Yeah.
I think I've never realized until now how heightened my nervous system was, like all the time. I was always like 1 second from snapping. And the thing is, I don't mean snapping really at other people, because what's always been really interesting is people have really perceived me overwhelmingly as really calm.
Yeah, you project chill very well.
Yeah, thank you. And what's funny is in the past there was an extreme contrast between how people perceived me and I guess how I presented and how I truly felt inside, which was like vibrating with anxiety and
Tell me what
fear
that
of
feels
failure.
like. The reason is because I know that. Like I know perfectionism, and I also know I'm like a doer, and my the biggest thing I've had to work on is when I'm not doing stuff, it feels like it's physically, it feels like it's in my chest. There's like a vibration, like anxiety, got to do something. Like what does it feel like physically for you before you went on medication, what that feels like?
It would just feel like I need to do something extreme. I need to hit something. I need to throw something. Yeah. So just a really kind of violent physical action. Which is, I mean, sometimes you're able to restrain it, sometimes not. Obviously, I've never hurt another person, which is all that matters.
There is healthy outputs. And, you know,
it's not
there's nothing wrong with punching a pillow. Right.
Yeah.
You know, sometimes you got to do that. And I've heard about a lot of people physically kind of working their way through that by being physical without harming others or themselves, obviously. So yeah, it's interesting.
I guess the
but
line
those impulses
for me is,
are normal, right?
That
we have.
It is.
Yeah.
But then I realized at a certain point there was, I think I realized it was a lot more harmful to me than I really had. Yeah, now I know that it was like the signs were there like a decade ago. You know, these were not healthy ways to deal with stress.
Yeah.
And slowly over time, like my parents noticed, and they also were like, "You can't do that." Not in a punishing way, but in a worried way. And then, it's always interesting how like in those moments in the past, you don't really realize. But then, with hindsight, you're like, it's so obvious. Like, it's amazing, could have been on medication a long time ago, or on some sort of religious meditation schedule. I don't mean like religious as in like, but I just mean like a strict meditation schedule or something like that.
A strict routine. Which people do use in dealing with that too. But I mean, I of course have gone medication route, and I'm on medication, and I find the same results as you do. In terms of leveling that out, and I think it's absolutely. I constantly am battling against the stigma against medication. Because I think it's important, but I also think it's important that once on medication and once you start feeling yourself, to still maintain and work on building good practice outside of it, right?
Yeah, because really what it has helped me do is deal with some of the physical symptoms that would prevent me from putting healthy habits in place. Like, for example, exercising is such a good outlet, and I usually feel 100 times better after I exercise. But I was so anxious, I'd be getting stomach cramps or really bad headaches, and it's like, well, I can't exercise if I'm feeling that way. I can't meditate if I'm feeling physically like I want to just, I don't know, rip my hair out or something.
So it's interesting. Like you've never had it because anxiety and mental health it affects us in such different ways. That is, it results in such different behavior. And mine is like shut down, lie down, like don't leave my room, blah, 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 all that kind of stuff. Yours isn't particularly like that. Like you... I
suppose not, yeah. Though there was a point probably during COVID where that was heightened, but I think that's something a lot of people experience. A lot of sense. I'm sure like that kind of, those kind of depression type symptoms really came out for a lot of people.
Well, you're kind of being told to act like you're depressed. Don't leave your house. Don't go and talk to people. Don't socialize. Like do everything that seems like depression is kind of what they were doing.
And maybe at a certain point it'll become depression.
And for a lot of people it did.
And it did, right?
We all know mental health issues spiked during COVID.
Oh, I know very well. My dad would bring home the statistics all the time. Yeah.
So I want to talk a little bit about, your discipline. Because you're obviously a very accomplished musician. You're a very accomplished guitar player, and you're a teacher, and you're a producer. And what I'm interested to know is, when you talk about having that feeling or that kind of excitability or that kind of stuff, how do you feel like that's informed you or driven you to where you are? Because, often like anxiety and that feeling of I got to do something, or I've got to do this, or I've got to be perfect can result in negative things. But you also, along the way, obviously it's resulted in some positive things. Yeah. So how did that inform you, or how did that drive you, those kind of habits that some could consider to be OCD or anxious or ADHD? How did that inform you, or was it like, I'm asking too long of a question here. I guess you ought to just let you answer. But I guess I'm just wondering how much of that was therapy, and how much of that served your mental health state, and still does serve your mental health state.
Yeah, I think it's a factor of all of those things. I mean, it is an incredible outlet. This sort of like meditative practice where I would do something over and over and over again.
I guess it's a lot of repetitive practice, etc.
It felt great to me. It felt like meditation. It felt like a release of stress and tension and everything. Though at the same time, underlying that was I need to be perfect, because if I'm not perfect, insert every catastrophic phrase here, you know? I think it would in many ways take away from my enjoyment of music, and it shaped and maybe controlled the way that I thought I had to approach music in a way that overall, over time, would not have been sustainable and would not have been conducive to a healthy life in any way. And I think it's one of those like paths where you play it through and you could see it being very disastrous for someone. Like, I mean, I'm not saying this is what would have happened for me, but I know it's like you can trace certain paths and be like, oh, you see how people end up with drug addiction and how people end up with other really, destructive ways to deal with extreme
in your industry
emotion.
in particular,
of course,
it's well documented. You know, you probably name a lot of your idols, and a lot of them have probably been, possessed the same kind of talents, the same kind of motor skills and everything that you do, but somewhere along the line, that's the medication route that they went.
Yeah.
And obviously you're well aware of that, and that's something you avoid. But so it's interesting because there seems like there's such a fine line of having these characteristics, or because a lot of people with mental health issues are brilliant people, and they don't find a good avenue to deal with those habits that they have established. And I think you're an example of finding a good avenue of dealing with it.
Been trying. Yeah. Again, I'm so grateful to have grown up in a family where going to therapy was something, we did sometimes. Like, I'm not saying, we would always just go to family therapy and whatever, because they're complicated dynamics.
Was it something you did as a family?
There was a period of time where we did.
So just double back. I'm very curious about the logistics of this, because so there's like 3 or 4 of you possibly. I understand it sounds like a 4-person family generally.
Yeah, 4-person family.
So this therapist that you're going to see is dealing with you and your sibling, and then a psychologist and a psychiatrist.
Yeah.
Interesting.
It is interesting. It didn't last too long, because I know there were some complicated
that would be difficult. There's a lot of kind of conflicts of interest going on there potentially, right?
Yeah, I'd say so. But then the therapist that I see now, I really started seeing her years ago with my mom at the time. But again, it was something that was okay and encouraged in many ways. And of course, my upbringing had its issues, no doubt. But I am very lucky that at the very least, that was something that I experienced. It wasn't, I wasn't afraid of having anxiety. I was just afraid of what I was experiencing.
That's a massive statement.
Yeah.
Because so many people have anxiety, and then it starts to feed on itself, obviously.
Of course.
The vicious cycle. Yeah. You're afraid of anxiety. I've been there before too. And that's why I asked about that question about coming off that airplane. A lot of people would get into a cycle at that point, and you didn't.
Yeah.
You know, definitely you have the benefit of having very informed and enlightened parents in the mental health realm. Yeah. Which is great. Yeah. So do you see as a counselor something you do pretty regularly?
Yeah. Every couple of weeks.
Yeah, I mean,
too. Yeah, even when things are going well. If anything, I feel
like probably the most important time to go.
I think that's when I have the most productive self-reflection, because when I'm actually going through something and I'm actually feeling really distressed, it's hard to think rationally. Exactly right. Because our minds tell us they tell us a lot of negative things, and we're just so trained to believe our subconscious thoughts. Yeah. Our automatic thoughts, and they're not true. Hint. Mm-hmm. But they feel real.
They do, because your brain is making them, so you think you're making them. But this brain thing is just something that seems to work willy-nilly, independent of itself.
Absolutely.
I mean, in some ways, it keeps our heart beating, it keeps us breathing, it keeps all this stuff functioning. But in many ways, it works anti to what we're trying to accomplish.
Yeah, like it's an enormous part of your sense of self and identity, obviously. But at the same time, it's also just an organ in your body that you need to separate your identity from sometimes, because you can know, for example, that something is good for you, but then in your body you can feel otherwise, and then sometimes you have to be like, I feel this way, but I know better, and you have to like outsmart yourself sometimes, especially when you know you have negative habits you've built.
It's so hard. And, you talking about that being in a state of heightened anxiety, or, that I would always want to, whenever I was super anxious, I would like, okay, I got to meditate. I can't meditate when I'm anxious. And it's just the same thing going into therapy. I can't communicate as well with my therapist when I'm really anxious, because really I'm dealing with a lot of emotion. My thoughts are not rational. That's why your point about it, that keep going, it's important to keep going, even when you're feeling good, because you can get so much more out of it. Yeah,
that's the great paradox of all of this, where when you feel positive, you don't think you need the things that help you deal with anxiety or depression or whatever it is.
But you feel good. You don't want to address it.
Yeah, but then you can't use these tools when you're in that state. So it's like all the meditation and the exercise and the therapy and whatever, like you have to put that in place when you're feeling more calm, so that they're there for you.
So one more question. You've got medication, you have your art and your discipline. What are the kind of tools you use to deal with anxiety and deal with your mental health, with stress? Because you're obviously, you probably have potential for a high stress lifestyle. Got a lot of ambition. You're growing, you're getting bigger in the world, in the musical community and in public in general. What kind of things do you do to kind of help navigate you through that?
I think medication has been incredible because it's helped me build so many healthier mindsets about quote unquote failure and about criticism or whatever. I feel like I am so much better equipped to deal with the things that used to completely uproot my sense of self when I was younger. And it's incredible now, the usual waves of anxiety that I pretty much had as a constant feeling. I don't really feel that anymore. Fabulous. I can't even explain how incredible that is. And this perfectionism thing, I feel like it's barely part of my life now. Like I still see it come through in a few areas, but generally speaking, I'm not afraid of making mistakes anymore. I feel like because I always grew up kind of knowing a better perspective, but feeling differently in my body. And I'd have this perspective of the problems I'm facing. Of course, they're real problems, like Viktor Frankl, suffering's relative. It's not real. It's not like it's not real suffering, but I think about how, yes, I'm going through something I find very unpleasant, but at the very least, I'm doing it with a roof over my head. There's no war. I don't have to worry about...
Perspective is very important.
And, I'd hold that perspective and at the same time still feel like I was going through something so extreme in my body.
Which you're allowed to. It's all relative. But that's a great point. Perspective. And one thing that I've just gathered from talking with you here tonight is basically educating yourself on it. And knowing is so much for the battle. Like knowing when your thoughts are going off the rails. And that's so much of a battle. I can't explain how great it was talking today. I really appreciate you taking the time to do this. And I can't wait. I'm looking forward to seeing all your musical endeavors in the future, because it's going to be amazing.
Thank you.
Okay.
Wow, that means a lot.
Yeah. Take care.
Thank you for listening to our Anxiety Stories. If you'd like to support this podcast or Anxiety Canada, go to anxietycanada.com.